Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Week 10, Lecture 1. We'll be looking at bureaucracies and the judiciary in a comparative perspective. Let's start with the bureaucracy. In almost any regime, in almost any country, bureaucracy does a great deal of the daily work that a regime must have to exist. And that really, in all candor too, the citizens need for their welfare and for human flourishing. Uh, the bureaucracy we may think of as the administrative system of any state. And it's the people who run the state from day to day. And also, especially in democracies, they last a lot longer in terms of their office, their time in office, than do the executives or the legislature or even the judiciary. So very often the bureaucracy we think of as the civil service. And these people serve often a whole career in that pursuit. They tend to be very specialized and to serve specialized functions. Unlike the legislature, unlike the executive or president, and unlike the judiciary, where one may be elected. Almost one is never elected typically to the bureaucracy. You're usually appointed and or work their way up based upon their ability. Bureaucracy also means a system where there's a concentration of administrative power. Often bureaucracy is associated with some very bad terms. For example, if you think of the idea of red tape. I had to go through a lot of red tape to get my financial aid this semester. I had to go through a lot of red tape to get my driver's license. I had to go through a lot of red tape to buy a house or whatever one is doing. That usually has a negative connotation. The idea of red tape is some kind of barrier that you shouldn't have to go through. And it's typically the bureaucracy that is that barrier that one has to go through. Often the bureaucracy is the part of a regime or state that is most resistant to change. It's their job to carry out the rules that have been established, typically by the legislature, perhaps in some cases by the executive. So they're the ones who most oppose change because they're the keeper of the rules. The importance of the bureaucracy in the 21st century is that bureaucracy is in charge of the day-to-day operation of the government. In that sense, they are administrative officials who have to follow the mandates of the citizenry, follow the law, but are also responsible to everyday political pressures, everyday political concerns. Some examples of bureaucracy, and these, again, as in all cases, are both in the textbook and in my alternative textbook that I call my lecture notes that I provide for you. If we talked about the executive as being the person who carries out the rules and is often elected. In some kinds of regimes, of course, it's not elected. In authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, we talk about the legislatures, it's also elected. And both are entitled and by law and typically by tradition to carry out laws. While the legislature typically has the power of the purse, the executive branch has the power of the sword, the power to act, with the legislature actually funding that action. We have the same kind of issue when it comes to the judiciary, and the judiciary has sort of the final interpretation of the constitution of a regime or country. So each one of the three, what we call typically major branches of a democratic system, and they function sometimes in the same ways in authoritarian and totalitarian systems, they each have their area, their separation of powers, their balance of authority that we have talked about earlier in the course. All those come into play, but bureaucracy is sort of out of range in a sense, and that we don't know bureaucracy, we don't tend to understand it as well, because we often don't understand the role that bureaucracy assumes. I want to talk about two very important models of bureaucratic behavior, how bureaucracies function. The first is a German social scientist by the name of Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R. He established in the early 20th century the idea of bureaucracy. And Weber is generally thought of as a defender of bureaucracy. It is a rational, normal way of handling the very complex structure, the very complex needs of countries, states in the 21st century, as well as in the 20th century. Also, in reality, bureaucracy goes back to antiquity, and many ancient regimes, as they grew, had bureaucracies. What Weber said was at the heart of bureaucracy, or to function, and what is that bureaucracy has, first of all, very fixed jurisdictions. It has certain areas of power, certain areas of expertise that it cannot exceed. It has specialized and differentiated functions. Those functions will basically limit any particular part of a bureaucracy in its scope and authority. However, as bureaucracy began to grow, as it has certainly since 1922, when Weber created or made the term famous, is that the state has become much more powerful. Bureaucracy has become much more bigger, and the role of bureaucracy has become predominant. Second of all, and this is really also an American insight, is that bureaucracy should be merit-based. The people who work in bureaucracy should be qualified. Now, in an American context, until the latter half of the 19th century, bureaucracy was dominated by political figures who agreed with the executive and could be approved by the U.S. Senate. And we call that system patronage. Patronage may be thought of as, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, metaphorically. That if you help a political candidate, if you work for a political candidate and that candidate's elected, that candidate then might give you a job or help you get a job. So it's a kind of a relationship. Now, there are advantages of patronage. Patronage, if you're an office holder, you had the support of whomever you asked to be part of bureaucracy. You had loyalty. You had people who would be with you in thick and thin. On the other hand, while they were loyal, they may not have any idea about what they're doing. You may hire them to be the roads commissioner, but they may not know cement from asphalt, from gravel. So they lack the expertise that's necessary to really carry out that function. Also, with the assassination of President McKinley, we realized by a disgruntled, upset office holder that there was some need for change. And so we create a civil service, or to use Weber's term, a merit-based system, where you had to prove, and you have to prove today, that you're qualified for any job in the federal government and most state government jobs. For example, it does not depend on the range of services where you might be an expert. You take an exam, a civil service exam, to be a rural postal carrier. Also, if you want to be at a very different level, to be a representative of the United States overseas and work for the U.S. State Department and work in an embassy, you have to take a foreign service exam. Even if you are wanting to join the U.S. military, we have an all-voluntary force in the 21st century, you take an exam, an ASVAB or some other type of exam that will tell you what you're qualified to do based upon your ability. So we have a merit-based system. Also, how you perform in that job necessitates whether you will be promoted or not be promoted. So that doesn't rule out patronage. Patronage is still part of the world of bureaucracy. Third issue that Weber talks about is hierarchy. This means that there's superiors who have authority, and those individuals under that superior or a large group of superiors also report to that superior. And that provides for the order of bureaucracy. There's also a chain of command where one lower order will follow the dictates of a higher order, and so and so and so. Fourth thing that Weber talks about is a written code. For example, in the United States, we talk about the federal bureaucracy. We talk about the U.S. code as a guideline of how things to be done, what the law is, and also in other countries there are certain codes. In Georgia, there's the Code of Georgia that also sets those goals and provisions for how bureaucracy should function and work. Bureaucracy has to follow certain rules. They are the keeper of the rules, and hence that's often the source of controversy. Well, what does bureaucracy do? What are the functions of bureaucracy? Typically, in comparative politics, one of the most important roles of a comparative bureaucratic system is that it collects revenue from taxes. They usually have a very specialized purpose for taxes and a specialized means for collecting taxes. Almost all regimes, especially in developed countries, have an incredibly sophisticated way of collecting taxes. In many countries, especially in Western Europe, the majority of one's income is paid in taxes. So it becomes a very important issue. In the developing world and in some developed countries, the second function of bureaucracy is national defense. National defense and the military is often one of the most demanding and rigorous and thorough bureaucracies, where the chain of command is actually very, very strict. A third role for bureaucracy is what we might call a service delivery. In England, for example, one of the most prominent and largest varieties of that is they're called the public health service, and where they provide health care. Many Western democracies and in some developing countries, authoritarian, totalitarian types of government, the regime itself provides for health care, all aspects of health care. In the United States, of course, we have a private system of health care, but in many countries, that's a major role of bureaucracy. Fourth is income maintenance. They provide a significant safety net. That's what we mean by income maintenance, a large safety net to provide for those individuals who would otherwise fall through the cracks, to provide for education, public, from elementary to college. So they provide a service function. Fifth role in almost all countries in the world in terms of bureaucracy is regulation. In modern democratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian countries, almost every aspect of human life is regulated. Now, I don't say that in a celebratory manner. It's just the nature and the complexity of life. To protect the environment, to protect the money supply, to protect the citizens, to protect the workplace, to protect food safety. Really thousands of purposes if we were to continue, but play a very important role in regulation. Sixth, and not to be underrated given the large size of bureaucracy in modern democracies and other forms of government, just managing the parts of the country, what we call in the notes the management of state enterprises. That is very, very important and very, very critical to maintaining this large bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has to police itself. It has to manage itself. It has to create its own management strategies and have its own basis for evaluating itself, improving itself, and making sure it's doing its job. Okay, this is the end of Lecture 1 on the bureaucracy in a comparative perspective. We'll now move on to Lecture 2 of bureaucracy and comparative perspective, and then we'll move on to the judiciary in a comparative perspective. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.